Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this closing event of the MediaRoad project and to talk to you about the question, why should we invest in media innovation? Now, for me, that question is very much related to the question, why should we invest in media? You cannot really separate one from the other. When I was preparing for this presentation, I kind of contemplated on the idea of sharing with you lots of economic reasons for investments. The profits made in the media sector, the number of startups, growing companies, growing employment, sometimes also falling employment, but in general, all the economic benefits of investing in media. Now, then I thought that most of the people in this audience already know all of these figures, and I didn't want to repeat a lot of the wonderful reports out there. So I decided on a different approach. I wanted to go a bit back in time, to take a bit of a historical approach, to explain why I think that investments in media and media innovation at the European level should go up, one, but also should be reoriented, and that's my second point. So when you go back 30, 40 years in time, you always see at the European level, but also in the different member states, that there seems to be this constant kind of panic related to the media sector and related to media innovation. If you have a look at the Bangeman report of 1994, but actually already also at preceding documents, think of the Green Paper on Television Without Frontiers, you see this kind of panic. It's not going well with the media sector. And this panic, if you look at all of these documents, is always inspired by a fear to lose out of the United States and in second instance from the Japanese and Asian market. Now, I hope I didn't do that. Tech people. Okay, I'll continue in any case. And what we've seen is that the media and innovation agenda at the European level has for a very long time been a tech-driven agenda. And you actually see that in quite a lot of policy documents, that it's not so much about media innovation, it's very much about tech innovation in media, which is something different, obviously. It's a lot about communication, ICT, and later on social media innovation. And at the same time, you obviously also saw a project that was very much oriented at economic policy making in media, at market harmonization, integration. I'm not saying that wasn't important, but what we saw as a consequence was that the really core media policies were rather complementary to this very tech-driven economic agenda. And it's also just not a surprise that a lot of these policies in part have failed. I was in a bit of a pessimistic mood when I made this presentation because I could also have said that the policies at the European level were partly successful. It depends on what perspective, obviously, one takes. Now, what we see today is kind of a renewed panic phase. You see a lot of the, what I call platform mania, a lot of talks about we need European policy because they're platforms and the platforms are screwing up the world. That's basically summarized what you see in a lot of not only policy documents, but also in, let's say, press releases and industry reports, a call for new European policy. And I do agree with that in the sense that you all know that in this platform age, let's say normal buyer-seller relations completely came to an end. One can argue, yes, but newspaper and broadcasting markets were always two-sided markets with broadcasters, newspapers mediating between consumers and advertisers. But there is a point to argue that platforms really have changed, certainly the super platforms. The GAFA have really changed the competitive dynamics in a market because they are accumulating so much intermediation and gatekeeping functions that they are effectively controlling entire media ecosystems, such as the online advertising ecosystems. So there is definitely a point, oops, went too fast there, to ask for more active EU policy making. I'm very happy also to hear that the Commissioner is very motivated to make these more active policies work. Now, this is all a bit of context, but panic in itself and a fear to lose out from the US does not answer the question, why should we rationally, not from here, but rationally, why should we invest in media innovation? Well, obviously you have the economic reasons. It's a sector of growth, it's a sector of employment. We produce locally, we also export. We export less than we would like to, but we do it. So you could argue there is a strong economic incentive for supporting media innovation. And my argument is that that economic incentive in itself will not really drive further media innovation policy. Why? Because if you would invest in other sectors, which is also happening, such as fintech or pharma, probably your economic return would be much bigger than in media. Well, not probably. This is demonstrated that has a much bigger return. So my argument is that you should always combine the economic rationale with the social one. Now, something I would briefly like to address is also that those people that say don't invest in media because investments in fintech or in pharma, they will bring more, or telecoms will bring more money to the economy, very often also say that legacy media, mainstream media, so that's a lot of you in the audience, are not innovative. That is something that you also, by the way, in scientific literature, you read that a lot, the defensive nature of broadcasters. They didn't see the changes coming. The newspapers, they didn't realize that the youngsters were changing. I think that's a completely nonsensical argument. There is no evidence whatsoever that proves that legacy media are not innovative. On the contrary, we have many examples. If you only look at digital audio broadcasting, if you look at high-definition television, there are many, many examples of the industry being innovative. Does that mean there have been no mistakes? Of course not. Does that mean that sometimes some companies haven't reacted a bit slowly? Of course not. But I really think that this is a very kind of persistent argument that you come across very often, not per se only at the European level, but also within national member states, that media are not innovative. I think we should really work on not only examples, but really on listing all the concrete realizations of media companies in the area of innovation. But even when you do that, the economic argument in itself will not do the trick. We should also invest in media and media innovation policy for societal and cultural reasons. And there I will say a few things about the GAFA. I'm not, for sake of clarity, I'm not against Google and Facebook or Amazon or Apple. I think wonderful companies most of the time. So it's not an anti-speech, but it's a pro-European content speech that I try to give here. So why do I think that investing in media and media innovation is so important for a societal and cultural reason? Well, it's because European Union should be concerned first and foremost with regaining control over, and I don't mean like government control, but regaining control over the cultural interfaces that people use to connect with culture and thus with society. What we see today is that a lot of people in the audience, and not only, let's say, the group up till 24, but increasingly also the somewhat higher age categories in which I'm also to be situated, that also this group is connecting to culture and content increasingly via platforms such as YouTube, Netflix, Facebook, Google. Again, nothing against them, but these platforms bring little value to, let's say, local societies, and they have no affinity with, perhaps as some of you know, I'm a Belgian from the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, Flanders, but Facebook or Google or Netflix have no affinity with who we as a Flemish community are, with our language, which is, well, Dutch, but not entirely like Dutch, but Flemish Dutch. They have no kind of affinity with togetherness of our society, with inclusion, with feeling some levels of empathy for people that are in a less privileged position than we are. And also they do not per se appeal to aspects of political, social, cultural citizenship. And I think that is one, or should be one, of the key concerns, and beyond the hype of disinformation, it really should be one of the key concerns for European policymakers, that we need to regain control over these cultural interfaces that connect European citizens on the one hand with our cultural expressions on the other hand. But that, of course, also holds corporate responsibility of the media. And I was a bit hesitant whether I would dare to say this, but freedom of speech, so I did it anyway, is besides this myth of legacy media not being innovative, there is also this myth of GAFA destroying democracy and legacy media contributing to it, being its safeguards and protectors. And I think it's also very important to be self-critical. I'm not denying here that there are a lot of legacy media that contribute to culture and to political citizenship and to debate and pluralism in debate and exchange of views, but we also have to face that there are a number of companies that don't do this adequately. And I can give many examples, but I think they're also mentally in your head of some broadcasters that are not speaking to the audience, they're not defending the public interest, but they are basically bringing state propaganda within Europe. There are definitely many newspapers that are going along with sensationalism, that actually explicitly ask people to vote for leave or remain at the same time. But I mean, there's a lot of scientific research, and we shouldn't throw that away, which is happening a bit the last year. As there is a lot of scientific research of the last decades that show that also legacy media have gone along in the story of sensationalism, of polarization in society. So I really think that the cultural and social argument is very important in making the plea for media innovation. But if you want to make that argument, if you also want to make that argument for let's regain control over our cultural interfaces, then you also need to walk the talk. So corporate responsibility in this area should improve to make that plea, I would argue, more credible. So yes, I would say we should invest in media and media innovation. I will skip that to stay within the allotted time and ensure time for the panel discussion. But what then to do? I have 3 minor suggestions of what I think is important that the next European Commission would take on board. The first one, bridge the gap between tech and innovation and content. Sorry, I really liked it that the Commissioner already said we need to look for synergies, but obviously it's about more than looking for synergies, it's also about replacing budget. Because it's very nice that you have programs that really try to bridge tech and content and creative innovation. But if the axis of the budget is still on purely technical innovation, that obviously is not changing enough. And that is really, and my research group is involved in a lot of innovation projects, Horizon 2020s, and it's all wonderful. But what we always see is that the weight is on the technological innovation. And if you don't combine the technological innovation with the content innovation, then basically lots of it will not work in media. You need to bridge the two, and if possible, add also some business model innovation to it. And I also think that the EU might stand out through this innovation because content is something that we're really good at. So if we can combine it with tech innovation, that would definitely be of big value. I also think, secondly, we should opt more and more for innovation with societal value. Very often innovation is focused on how can we anticipate consumer wants. So it's very consumerist and logic, but we should more and more also focus on what do citizens need. I know that sounds very paternalistic, but that's why I'm an academic, we can do that. I'm not saying we shouldn't work on algorithms and chatbots and virtual assistants and augmented reality and all of these wonderful stuff, but when we do it, we should also focus more on diversity by design, on serendipity and stuff like that. So I'm really making an argument for ethics in innovation as a next frontier. And I think if Europe would in its innovation policies focus one more on bridging tech and content innovation and two would focus more on the ethics in innovation, that would really be something where we could differentiate ourselves compared to other continents. And then finally, I also think it's very important to allow and enable the European companies to innovate. Of course, I'm very much in favor of competition law. Lots of people here will be in favor of competition law and will say, yeah, wonderful that the European Commission has a look at abusive practices of Google, of Amazon and stuff like that. But at the same time, a too formalistic implementation of competition rules should also not prevent our companies from collaborating, for example, to offer on-demand services together. That's only one example, but I'm sure that most of you are familiar to it. And this was really a stance where a too formalistic implementation at the European level, but also in member states such as the United Kingdom, well, for the moment, where such a too formalistic implementation really stopped their own companies from innovating. And that's a bit also what I would like to say, is that also our own regulatory frameworks, I'm thinking about the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, but also the GDPR, at some point, and that is something that historically speaking always comes back. We also saw that with the Television Without Frontiers Directive. As Europeans, we sometimes have a very big talent to invent regulation that 1, 2, 3, 4 years after implementation turns out to have benefited those that we did not want to benefit. So we need some more evidence-based impact assessments before going into such regulatory changes. Now, a final, this is not I quit, but I'm nearly there, don't worry. In this book, I wrote together with my colleague Tom Evers on platform power and policy in transforming television markets. We also noticed that some policymakers, and that is something I would argue you see more at the national level and at the European level, actually also say, you know, this platform world, this GAFA environment, we give up on media regulation and we give up on media innovation policy. There is no point in doing it. We cannot, the world has become so big, we cannot do this anymore. Obviously, that's the last thing that they should do. Otherwise, we should also not pay them for being in politics if they cannot make policy or don't want to. And I really think if policy would be refocused on these 3 points, tech and content, ethics and innovation, and looking for a more economics impacts-based implementation of competition law, that would already improve a lot. I will conclude. Media matter. Not so much because it's your business, sorry, but because it's about our culture. I know that sounds terribly academic, but it's really what I think. And I think that that basically, the bottom line, besides the economics, besides all the fancy stuff that we will see in the room next door, and I also like that, but besides all of that, the most important reason to invest in media, and thus also in media innovation policy, is because it's about our culture and about our societies. Thank you very much.